Okay, good morning and welcome to our Wednesday morning devotion for the 27th of July. The 27th of July today. Uh, we started this devotion yesterday, making sense of suffering, which is kind of what we're looking at on Sunday as well from First Peter. We left off with him saying, actually, reinforcing a couple times about life and suffering, and it's a mystery. It's a mystery, and we've got to be okay with it. Can't control it. So we pick up today with him saying suffering is an inevitable part of life, but it doesn't have to be meaningless. Like so many things in life that we have little or no control over, how we respond to suffering makes all the difference. Jesus counsels us this way in John chapter 16, verses 20 to 22. I tell you, you will weep and mourn, but the world will rejoice. You will have pain, but your pain will turn into joy. When a woman is in labor, she has pain because her hour has come. But when her child is born, she no longer remembers the anguish because of the joy of having brought a human being into the world. So you have pain now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. This passage alone is proof enough that Jesus sees suffering in a completely different light than the world does, and that his conception of suffering is radically different from how I would view it if I were left to my own devices. Fortunately for us all, Jesus doesn't leave us to our own devices. Amen to that. Suffering reminds us, perhaps more than anything else, that God's ways are not ours. We live in a secular culture that despises suffering as useless and proclaims that it should be avoided at all costs. As a result, pain relievers are constantly being thrust at us in the form of pills, products, experiences, and distractions. The world has its own gospel. The message of the world is incomplete. And nothing demonstrates this incompleteness more than the world's inability to make sense of suffering. The world cannot make sense of suffering because it views suffering as worthless. The world has no answer for the inescapable, unavoidable, and inevitable suffering of our lives. Jesus has an answer for everything. The Old Testament scriptures tell us that suffering is the consequence of sin. In the Old Testament, suffering is presented as a punishment inflicted by God as a direct result of humanity's sinfulness. In the New Testament, Jesus boldly announced with his words and actions that suffering has value. It is a tool that can transform us into more loving people. It ushers us into higher spiritual realms. Salvation and the suffering of Jesus are inseparable. So what could be more meaningful than suffering? Now let's be very clear. I'm not suggesting that we should go looking for suffering. And there is a great deal of suffering in this world that you and I can and should do more to relieve. But the inescapable suffering of our lives has a purpose. We can try to run from it, or we can accept it and allow it to transform us in unimaginable ways. We can allow it to make us more fully. For hundreds of years, Christians have whispered to each other, offer it up. The scriptures encourage us to offer everything that happens in our day, the joys and the suffering, to God as a prayer. Suffering is a powerful prayer. Once we come to this realization and begin to surrender to the inevitable suffering of life, offering it to God as a prayer for ourselves, for our friends and family, for the world, we'll become filled with a deep and abiding peace. Jesus promised us suffering. His leadership was unique and awesome. He didn't sugarcoat things or pretend. He led by example and asked for great commitment from those who wanted to follow him. For more than 2,000 years, the heroes, champions, and saints of Christianity have been meditating on the passion and the death of Jesus Christ. Perhaps it is time we all spent a little time exploring the genius of the cross. The world changed at 3 o'clock on that Friday afternoon when Jesus laid down his life for us. That was how he changed the world. Radical. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. Luke 9:23. The mandate is clear. I don't know what your cross is, but I sure know what my own is. Some days I am more reluctant than others to pick it up and carry it. That's life. What cross is Jesus inviting you to take up and carry today? Whatever it is, the risen Christ wants to help you carry it. You are not alone. The point to ponder today is this: suffering transforms us in unimaginable ways. The verse to live, we mentioned Romans 5:3-4. We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. The question to consider: are you willing to suffer a little in order to grow spiritually? Are you willing to suffer a little in order to grow spiritually? And here's the prayer. Jesus, teach me to embrace the unavoidable suffering of life, and keep me ever mindful of those who suffer more than I do. That's always a helpful thought for me when I'm complaining in my, if not out loud, at least in my heart and mind about things that have such little significance compared to the cross, compared to eternity. And then I remember, I see it on the news all the time. There are so many who have it so much worse than I do. My dad had a sign, and I have it. When I cleaned out their apartment, I found it, and I said, that's from my childhood. It reminded me a lot. He had it in his study. I had no shoes, and I complained until I met a man who had no feet. Just remember, in the middle of whatever's going on, how blessed you are through God's love for you and Christ's sacrifice. Blessings today.